Hello, Jordan.
Hi, Miriam. So happy to be
Welcome to
here
the show.
today.
Yes, yes, we already warmed up a little bit. So let me throw this question at you. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator?
Ooh,
Do
big
you?
question. And I definitely do. I mean, I'm a storyteller, so is it okay if I tell a bit of a story?
Please.
Yeah. So for me, the big story, like capital S story of my life happened about 10 or 11 years ago. I was living in Vancouver, which is where I live today, and I had a girlfriend, and she came up with this idea for us to spend 1,800 miles walking down the west coast of America. And this idea, if you can imagine, just kind of came out of the blue. And suddenly I found myself arguing over things like tents and sleeping bags and hiking boots and routes and all of these things with no real context to it. It would be as if, you just, what are we having for dinner? Thai food. We're walking to Mexico. And I found myself in this really stunning kind of like planning for this strange thing that I kind of half wanted to do, but didn't really want to do. And as you might imagine, the relationship started to fall apart. And when she left, I panicked. And I like to say I'm a child of the 80s. So I was raised on romantic comedies. So, what do you do when your girlfriend leaves you? Yeah. What do you do when your girlfriend leaves you? Well, you do one huge romantic gesture to try to get her back. And, because the one piece of what I considered leverage at the time, I like to joke I was 29 going on 17. The piece of leverage I had was this idea to walk to Mexico. And so 2 weeks later, I put up a video on this brand new website at the time called Kickstarter. And I pitched this idea to make an art project, photography, travel, storytelling, walking to Mexico. It wasn't even half baked. It had barely been in the oven. And I put it up on the internet. And what I really wanted was for her to see it and for her to interpret that, like, this expression of love was this, it was speaking about the truth of our relationship. We were going to live happily ever after. But what actually happened is it became Kickstarter's project of the day. And so I was featured front and center on the Kickstarter website. And I had asked for $5,000 and suddenly money was just kind of rushing in. And next thing I knew, after I think 9 days, I had the $5,000, which meant I was now committed to, in the end, 138 people who gave me money to walk from Canada to Mexico. And so I remember on that day I got money. I went out for sushi in downtown Vancouver with my now ex-girlfriend. And I was pleading with her, like, I've got the money to do the thing that you've been talking about for this whole time. And what she literally said is, I'll think about it. And I spent the rest of the summer kind of hanging on this, like, is she going to do it? Was that just the kind of thing you just say to kind of brush somebody off? And long story short, on September 1st of 2010, I left Vancouver with a big backpack and a huge heavy heart. And I spent the next 316 days walking down the west coast of America by myself.
Wow.
Right. And what I think is interesting about my trip is that, there's a very famous hiking trail through the US that's called the Pacific Crest Trail. And that goes through forests and mountains. It was if you know that book Wild by Cheryl Strayed, she walked that. And that's a trip where you're like out in the wilderness face to face with bears, and who else can imagine what else is out there. But for me, I decided to walk the coastline, which meant I was walking down beaches and trails and through forests, but I was literally going through towns and cities. So over the Golden Gate Bridge into San Francisco, I walked through LA. I was in all these smaller towns along the coast of Oregon and Northern California. And that meant that I was having these interactions with just normal people. So I would be in a cafe and, I had my big beard and my big backpack with all my camping gear, and friendly people would kind of make conversation as I'm drinking my coffee and say, like, where are you going? And I'd be like, I'm walking to Mexico. And people would then ask the follow-up question, which of course was, why? And I would be like, my girlfriend left me, blah, 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 blah. And like the whole soul and heart of my story would come pouring out. And slowly I started to realize that my story had gravity to it. And what gradually started to happen is, as I got sick of hearing myself complain, I started to ask other people, have you ever been through something like this? What's your love story? And I would spend hours with strangers in all these different circumstances, like recording people's stories. and like dredging out this deep emotional stuff inside of them. We'd have this moment, I would cry, you would cry, we'd hug, I'll never forget you again. And then I'd leave the cafe and I'd walk 100 yards. And then there was somebody working in their garden and they'd be like, hey, where are you going? And I'd be like, I'm walking to Mexico. And so in the end, I probably did this with about maybe 5,000 different people. And so gradually I started to think of myself as like a facilitator of experiences, because I would show up with these people and I would bring my literal and figurative baggage. And as I kind of unpacked it, we would look at it together and we'd figure out, okay, well, what do we have in common? What's your baggage that you want to lay out in front of us too? And at the end of my little show, I would pack up my baggage and continue on. But that was when I first started saying, okay, there's something here, there's a skill. I didn't know what it meant professionally yet, but I started to feel almost as if this facilitation was my calling. And, now fast forward over the last 10 years, I've been able to start to put it into a variety of different forms. But for me, facilitation is the doing, not just the job title, if that makes sense.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing this story.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And it's impressive how it unfolds on so many different levels, also starting from the relationship issues. First, yes, ending. Yes, let's do that, without actually knowing what you're buying yourself into. And then the storming phase that the relationship didn't survive. And then saying yes again, trying to make it happen, and then having to do it by yourself. What became possible for you from a mindset and skill set through this challenge?
I think from a skill set perspective, the ability to listen and to sit with people, and specifically to help take people to depth. Like I think when I was younger and more naively, I thought people were what I'll just call their artifice. People are as they appear. You have to take what people say at face value because they said it. In a couple, I said, I'm sorry, and then slowly it was like, oh, there's actually layers of meaning beneath these words and these ideas and the way that we show up. And as I peeled back the layers in myself, I started asking myself this succession of very therapeutic questions, starting first with like, why did she leave me? And then it's like, why do I always date girls like this? And then it's like, well, what role do my parents' divorce have in, what's my trauma? And then eventually, like, what do I do about my trauma and how do I come back together in a different form so that it can be healed in some way? As I was doing these things, like I joked at the beginning, I'm 29 going on 17 and I have to get her back and Kickstarter and all this, like, here I have the stereo over my head, like John Cusack and Say Anything. I'm imagining myself in this very heroic way, but like, where did that identity even come from? Who told me that was the right way to do things?
Yeah.
So, I'm a systems thinker, and I never really stopped and took the microscope or the microscope of systems thinking and put it back on myself. And by doing that, I think that started to build a mindset that now makes it possible professionally. I try to bring the same, or I do bring the same thing to client engagements. What's really going on here? Yeah, sure, go ahead.
And this actually circles nicely into the question that came up for me is the role of storytelling. You mentioned that at one point you felt the gravity of your story and like, okay, I cannot drag this story with me. I have to reinvent the story, and I have to, almost as if you can reinvent yourself by the story you're telling of yourself. So what did you learn about storytelling in this journey? And what do you think that most people still get wrong about storytelling?
I think most people think that story is history. So, there's multiple layers there. One is like, if you ask people, Miriam, how did you become who you are today? Most people will default to what you can think of as like a chronology.
CV.
Well, when I was 22, I graduated from this university and then I had this job and then this happened and then that happened. And, fact. And then here I am today. So there's that's all true. It's not that you're lying. It's just that there's I want to say almost a shallowness to that. It's
And
like you're
nobody
never
cares.
actually, yeah, what did you say?
Nobody cares.
Nobody cares, and you're never taking me into the depth. And what actually is interesting about story is its three-dimensionality. It's like, how did your world operate back then? And how did the transformation enact some kind of transformation in the way your world functioned?
Mm.
You know, for me in my story, like so much of my story is about reinventing relationship, you know, relationship to my ex, relationship to my future wife, relationship to my parents. I didn't yet understand that all of those things were in dynamic opposition to each other, kind of like a molecular structure.
Mm.
And the thing is that as you start to pull one of those molecules, the whole structure starts to shift. And so when in storytelling, it's the same thing. Like at the beginning of a great Netflix show or a movie, we meet a character, but what we're really meeting is the structure of their world. This is their partner. This is their estranged parent. This is their bad job that they don't love anymore. And then over the course of the movie or the show, we watch them move through this transformation that shifts the molecules as well. I think as storytellers, it's like what we're looking for is not the history of what happened, but like what's actually happening in the molecular structure, because that's where the real story is. So on this trip, I would listen to people, and I would listen not just for like, what's the surface story, but like, what's the story you're really telling? And what does that reveal about what you believe about the world and how you came to that place? You know, storytelling at depth.
Yeah. It reminds me of a book that I recently read. It's called You're Not Listening and Why It Matters. And there the author, I don't remember her name, mentioned that what we often forget to ask is, why is this person telling me this piece of information right now?
Mm.
And just this extra level of curiosity that would then replace the judgment of, oh, why are you telling me that? Already know that? Do you want to teach me? It's kind of, oh. And then why is this person telling this story in this way?
Yeah, you know, story theory is that every character has wants and needs. You know, there's a tension between what I want and what I need. And often what I want, what I think I want at a conscious level is in opposition to what I need. You know, I need my girlfriend back. It's like, well, no, what I really needed was growth and perspective and wisdom. And to see that, oh, the relationship wasn't really working in the first place, you know?
And maybe self-love.
And self-love. And, you know, we can go down that rabbit hole, right? But in organizations, it's the same thing. It's like, I want to hit this goal. And it's like, okay, cool. What do you need here? What do you mean I need to hit this goal? It's like the conversation becomes really circular because it's too shallow.
So how did you break, how do you help them to break out from this vicious circle?
I mean, that's a really deep question, you know, for 5 minutes or 10 minutes into the conversation. I wish there was sometimes I wish I had a magic wand where I could just, you know, wave stuff over somebody. Yeah, done. Transformation, that's going to be $50. See you later, you know? I think for me, it's like understanding the structure of psychology and belief inside of myself then helps me kind of tease out where it's hollow in somebody else. You know, I love Esther Perel. You must know Esther Perel, of course.
Yes.
And I remember listening to one of her podcasts, Where Should We Begin, where she does the thing with the couple. And she used this really lovely metaphor of knocking on the wall of a relationship to listen for where it's hollow. And, you know, you hit the right note somewhere and you're like, oh, there's a stud. There's a stud. There's a stud. Oh, this is the space where there's not much weight to what the person is saying. And so for me, it's like a felt experience where I listen and someone says something and I'm like, that doesn't just click right in me. It's not landing. So that's where I start to scratch the surface. And then, you know, the different style or the limiting beliefs start to come out. You know, I feel my way in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And for me, this sounds, and maybe I'm ignorant, surely I'm naive. This sounds like a coaching practice. So I can perfectly imagine you doing this on a one-on-one context and to help individuals, leaders to differentiate between their needs, their wants, recraft maybe their story. If I'm not mistaken, you're doing this for organizations. So how can I imagine that? So because there's a big level of abstraction there.
Well, certainly, and a very specific level of practicality. Imagine like, yeah, you can do coaching one-on-one with someone in the same way you can do therapy one-on-one with somebody, but then you bring your partner into the room and now you're doing therapy on the relationship. The relationship is a different entity than the two people involved. There's the two people, and then there's the construct of what we've created together. And I think that's very digestible in a marriage, of course, or, in a relationship, but it's the same thing in a group or team environment. It's like, we are all a group of individuals, whether we're two or whether we're 200,000, and we're subscribing to something that has a life and a narrative of its own. And, when you start to dig into these narratives, whether they're my own story or the story of my company, they're mythic in that they have these structural ideas about what does it mean to be in a company? What does it mean to have a boss? What does it mean to work? What does it mean to perform? Those are the stories that we take for granted often when, I just need a job. So you've got a job, so I'm going to get hired by you. It's like, when you look back on that, you start to realize, oh, I was connected to something in this boss that didn't appeal to me in that boss. So just to say that there's this complexity of narrative, and in the same way that Esther Perel knocks on the wall and finds something that's hollow in an individual or in a couple, when you knock on the wall, you can find things that are hollow in the organization. As an example, some of the stories are, this will never work. We've already tried that. That's not the way you're supposed to do it. Those are mythic, defined stories that exist in people's day-to-day that sometimes are incorrect or out of touch. Yeah, go for
it. Yes. I totally get that. And I believe that individuals are very talented in crafting a clear story to make this belief valid and to validate it wherever they can, and to defend it against this. The beautiful word you used in our exploration call was corporate therapist.
Yeah.
Or facilitator. So what is your strategy to get your finger in this story to make them realize that it's maybe not valid and still not to be thrown out the door after the first why question? Or
well, the strategy is be honest and be real with people. So, when those mistaken or limiting beliefs start to come up, then it's slow them down and help them unpack it. When I grew up as a consultant, I'm a consultant now, but I'm in my young 40s. When I grew up, to be a consultant was to provide the solution. So I felt a lot of pressure to kind of come in and solve people's problems for them, right? And over the last couple of years, it's been a reinventing of what it means to be a consultant. Now what I bring is space and process.
Facilitation.
Which means, right? What'd you say?
Facilitation.
Yeah, I bring facilitation, where it's not where the success of the engagement doesn't hang on me coming up with some sort of solution to your problem. You would never go to a therapist for your relationship and ask for a diagnosis and, what are the 3 pills I should take and call me in the morning. You go, you go because you want to engage in some sort of a process. And so similarly, what I'm really good at is revealing what is happening beneath the surface here that's interfering. And I think, in general, business has been really myopic in the sense that everything is about goals. Everything is about a straightforward way to get there. And if you don't have the right tool, you go out and you buy or you implement the tool. And so everything becomes layer upon layer upon layer of system. And, there was a certain validity, and that works in some contexts for some time. But part of what's happening right now in the world is there's an underlying transformation about what business is and what role organizations should fill. Like I was in the car the other day listening to a radio story about Burger King, who posted something about, they posted something on Twitter about more women should be in the kitchen. And it got everybody all riled up. And it was like, no, more women should be chefs. Something like 29% of chefs are women and there should be more women. So it's like, great argument, but it's Burger King. Like, what, 5 years ago, to think that Burger King would be wading into feminist issues would be totally unthinkable. And now it's, as they say, it's table stakes. And so suddenly the function of an organization in the world and in the lives of employees has shifted literally overnight. And so often the limiting belief is like, oh no, we're still doing business in the way we were doing it in the 2010s. And it's like, it's not like that anymore. So like my process is, at some level, helping people realize that, but helping them come to that realization in their own way.
And just a quick sidetrack before coming back to the facilitation bit. Do you think that this change is due to the pandemic, to the last week's podcast guest called it the great pause that we collectively went in? Or is it due to working from home? Or what is it that made this shift happen?
I would say D, all of the above. It's like, it's a little bit of everything. And it's also the things that we don't quite understand yet. It's like, it's not, and by that I mean, some of the reason for the change isn't immediately apparent. It's not necessarily causal. I think some of the things that are at play here is the pandemic, climate change, new technologies, like suddenly we can interact with each other and therefore search for work, engage with companies, buy different products in ways that were unthinkable even a couple of years ago. Then there's like the overarching political and social narratives, George Floyd, Me Too, like what it means to live in society is shifting so monumentally. And all of that stuff is happening in tandem with each other.
And I wonder whether the fact of not going to the office on a daily basis
Totally
put us away from one echo chamber, maybe into a different echo chamber, because I don't believe that we got rid of the echo chamber or that we haven't lived in one before the pandemic. But maybe before, just being in this office routine, where we were exposed to the same narrative, the same story on a daily basis that we didn't take time to question. Suddenly we are now in a different context. We have access to different information, and maybe we have more distance to what it means to be at work. Actually.
Yeah, I entirely agree. And when I was younger, before I did this big walking trip, I loved to backpack. So I backpacked in India and Southeast Asia and South America, like all these different places. And, the great privilege of backpacking style travel is the collision with other culture, where, there I am on this pack train in India, where like people are around me everywhere. And I'm like living and breathing this experience temporarily in a certain way through a certain identity and body and so on. But I'm also really forced to confront the collision of culture between what I thought was normal before and what is normal now. And I think you're making a great point. It's like what I thought was normal in the office is like, oh yeah, I can bring my kid to work, but one day a year, where I show the kid like, this is how work works and this is my office and these are my colleagues and now back to school with you. And suddenly it's like, no, my kid is running in the middle of my meeting and you're going to have to accept it. And maybe even they're part of it in some way. And that's just one example of many, many of the way we're shifting what it means to go to work. And I think that is one of the elements that's playing a massive role here. And I think it's just one step more. It's like all of those things are true. It is all of those things, but it's also something a little bit beyond, where like we're questioning some of the core ideas about what it means to be human, what it means to be in community, in relationship, a citizen of the planet, and so on. And I think we don't have the answers yet. And by that, I mean, I think there's a new answer coming that hasn't arrived yet. And I think that's also a driver for this change.
Which makes me wonder, and come back to something you said earlier about the role of the advisor or consultant. That before the consultant came in, let me tell you what you do. I have it. I have my spreadsheets and I have my PowerPoint presentations, and let's go to work, get to work. And this has changed to coming in and rather facilitating a conversation exploration where the organization finds out themselves. And I wonder whether the 2020, this great pause, also the great we don't know, where collectively for the first time, maybe in history, we collectively had permission to say, we don't know. Maybe this has accelerated the shift from being, or from calling consultants and expecting consultants to know, to calling facilitators and being open to find out. Or am I maybe too optimistic?
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's the rise of process over outcome. You know, like once upon a time, to be in work was to be outcome focused. And to be a facilitator, you know, I was thinking about this in preparation for this call, like the etymology of facilitator is like to be an easy maker. You know, we're professional easy makers. And the wonderful thing about being an easy maker is it's massively interchangeable. Like the traffic police officer who's directing traffic at an intersection is a facilitator. They're an easy maker. In the same way that we're a facilitator when we're in a group conversation. And I think one of the things that's happening for us in our job function is like, to be a facilitator used to be helping people have a conversation or lead a workshop. But now it's like, how do you easy make in any context? How do you easy make change? How do you easy make transformation? How do you easy make visioning? This isn't just about like showing people the steps, but it's in some way participating in the creative journey with people. You know, like one more thing, I try to easy make vision and empathy. So like how I do it, whether that's in workshops or conversations or consulting or whatever, is separate from what it is I'm trying to do. I'm trying to help people see in a new way. And when you can see in a new way, you can solve in a new way, but you can't solve in a new way until you see in a new way. You have the seeing comes first.
You need to be able to at least imagine a better future.
Totally.
Thinking back of the corporate therapist.
Totally. Can I pause just to close my window?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Suddenly the sun came out. It's beautiful, you know?
Yes. It was interesting to see the stripes.
Yeah, the light come across my face.
Nice cinematographic kind of little thingy. Gordon.
Moody Monday morning lighting.
Gordon, please cut this part out.
Yeah.
Yeah, to come back, I'm kind of fascinated by the idea of the similarity or the perception of a facilitator like a therapist, where I'm also thinking of a book that I recently finished where the author referred to a relationship where everyone brings in 100% of responsibility. It's not shared responsibility. No, everyone has the full 100% in order to make it work. And in an organization, it's the same. And you don't book one therapy session. It's just, if you sign up, you know that it's a process, it's a long-term thing that requires sweat and tears, hard work, and collaboration. Do you think then that the times of a one-off workshop facilitation are somehow over? Because we have to recognize that we cannot do any work in a one-off session.
I think so, but I don't think they'll disappear overnight. You know, because there's a lot of people who don't work at this level. And frankly, there's a lot of buyers who want to buy something that's like a one-off solution. And so, I mean, I have this pressure in my business all the time where people are like, yeah, but can you just do it in 4 hours and can it happen next week, you know? And it's like, well, it depends what you want to happen. And for some people, that question in itself is too intense because it means breaking down the whole corporate structure. Like, what do you mean? I have my budget, I have my deliverables, I already know how this is going to work. do you fit into this? And my role is to subvert the whole way of thinking and to be like, no, no, no. What do you want to have happen? What's the vision here? And that's really off-putting or disconcerting for people because it's confusing. And I would say too, like in corporations to this day, the paradigm that people use to talk about change is called change management. You must have heard this term before. And what change management means is we're in state A, we're trying to get to state B, and here are the series of steps and communication plans and workshops that we're going to use to manage somebody's change from A to B. And I think the paradigm is shifting into something that's much more about A to infinity, where it's like, how do I go to a place I've never experienced before? How do I go to a level of creativity, a level of 100% responsibility, a new working dynamic that I've never physically had an experience of before? You can't just tell me about what that is. You got to actually take me there emotionally into that and let me try it out and let me panic and let me go through the chaos that's going to ensue. I can't come in and say, well, it's going to start with this, and in 3 months, this is going to happen. In 6 months, this is going to happen, because it's too mysterious and dynamic and alive. And I think it's scary for corporations because of that, because it's uncontrollable, but it can be influenced and it can be done well, even though it doesn't have that same level of control, if that makes sense.
Yes, it makes a lot of sense. And it indeed sounds scary because it sounds like something that doesn't have an end, as you said. So it's an ongoing process and project in a world that needs budgets and timelines. It's a very scary thought. And I think it can equally be scary for the therapist, I'm saying, the facilitator. See, the facilitator coming in, not knowing what they can actually promise, which we never can, because it depends on the group. And still to engage then in, it's almost like a task for a wizard, embarking on a journey where we don't know the end, where we shoot for the moon. So what's the inner game that this future role of facilitators?
Yeah, well, I would say that it starts with the magical word discovery, where you come in and I have the humility sometimes, not always, right, to be like, I actually don't know what's best here. And no matter how much time I spent planning and thinking about what I thought this was going to be, do I have the ability to think on my feet and see what's actually happening in real time? And so I have to make sure that my clients don't feel like, oh, this is just going to be this open-ended thing we're going to be throwing money at for the next 10 years. It's got to have some discrete deliverable. It's got to have some direction and outcome. And what a good discovery does is it allows for the outcome to emerge. There's this moment of like, oh, I see what's going on here. Like, this is the diagnosis. And now here are the steps that we can take to interrupt old patterns, experiment with doing it in a different way, engage people in the process of transformation, but also keep the corporate goals in mind. So find a way to balance those two things. So it's not like the kind of parody of therapy is like, It's like, no, it has to be more precise and it has to be impactful, but it needs to start with some discovery of what that even means.
And what it means for those who are engaged, right? Because again, if I think of the opposition of the consultant who comes in, okay, that's our plan for the change management. These are our milestones. These are the deliverables. And then suddenly it becomes a management process in the way that, okay, I tell you what you do, and then you do it, and then you change, and then we check the boxes. Where now what I'm hearing from what you say is more about, okay, let's identify what the real issue is and then define the milestones together that we want to reach in our collaborative work.
And I mean, to your earlier question, like part of the inner game is a redefinition of what power means.
Mm.
Like once upon a time, to be powerful was to be in a position that brought all the, the trappings of power. I remember in the spring, I saw an article in the newspaper. There was a photograph of the G7 finance ministers. So, the most powerful countries in the world, the finance ministers, and they were all posing for a group shot, Russia and, Canada, US, all these, Britain, France, and they're all dressed in matching dark suits, matching understated corporate ties, and matching black face masks because it's the pandemic with their little country flag in the middle. And I'm looking at these people and I'm going like, these are the most powerful people in the world. They don't even get to decide what they wear in the morning. And I think part of what's shifting in the world is a definition of what power is and how power works. Like in the old organizational structure, to be powerful was to tell people what to do. And, oh, we can't tell our employees the truth because then they're going to all leave. Well, guess what? They're already leaving. So what we have to figure out is how do we share power in some way where, like, we are taking, to use your lovely word, 100% responsibility. I'm responsible for a certain level of management and direction and vision, but that doesn't make me better than you. It just means I manage a different portfolio of what power means. And when we start to see that, we can start to subvert the idea that, like, I need to be in charge of this every step of the way. So often that's where the therapy happens. It's like for the person running the whole project. Are you trying to maintain your own power here? And are you willing to shift something about the way you think about management? Because if you do, you can make possible something that wasn't possible before when you were the one who had to be in charge. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes. And I wonder, the association that I have is that the way you describe power, or new definition of power, is almost like what happens with love. If you keep love to yourself, it dies. But if you share love, it increases, right? The more you share it, the more there is. And from what I hear you saying is, with power, it might be similar, which is counterintuitive, especially in the old world, if we may already call it like this.
Yeah, I agree. It's like, do I feel my power inside of myself? Do I see, like, not just my structural power and my privilege, like that stuff is so important for me to see, but power is also my ability to, like, face a important challenge in my life and be honest and vulnerable with myself and others. And when I start to see that my power is, like, infinite in an inner sense, then it's way easier for me to give it away. Like, I don't need to be the one who's speaking over you to tell you all the things I think. I think a lot of things, but in this context, in this conversation, like, it's not appropriate for me to be the one who occupies all of the space.
Yeah, and this is thank you for pointing this out, because it's giving away power, or sharing power does not mean giving away even 1% of this 100% of responsibility, right? It's carrying the baggage and still sharing.
Totally. And then I can be both. Like, sometimes I need to be authoritative, and sometimes I can be more giving or forgiving or space making. Like, as a facilitator, I'm always trying to figure out, what does the moment call for? And do I need to interrupt this blowhard who's just talking and talking and won't stop? It's like, sometimes it's like, hey, we heard enough from you. Now we're going to hear this person. There's my, like, authoritative. And then other times it's like, oh, let me relax and let me be in this kind of weird, mysterious uncertainty and just kind of allow things to happen for a little while because it feels like it's going somewhere.
And what makes the difference?
In terms of the approach, or?
Yes. So what is a moment where you let it happen, and what is the moment you interrupt? And is it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's so nuanced. I would say at the simplest level, it's like intuition and empathy. Maybe one step more is like reading the room and feeling the room. I said earlier that, like, part of what I see in my work is I'm a facilitator of vision and a facilitator of empathy. And it's my experience of those things is not just conceptual, but they're like music notes. It's like when you go to a good party and you walk into the room and you just kind of feel like everyone's having a really good time. You could diagnose the qualities in bullet points, like, good food and space and great people, but that's not the feeling that the room creates. So, sometimes there's like there's a note or a chord that gets struck, and I can viscerally feel it in my body as if something is singing out, and I'm trying to respond to that.
Mhm.
I know that's really abstract, but I'm trying to keep it there. Like, one of my favorite passions on the side is I just got into the past couple of months ecstatic dancing, which is like, yeah, you're into it too. It's like, I never would have thought to be into something like this. And I grew up as like a straight guy in the world. My dancing moves were like boom, 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 boom. Everything's like low and don't look at me. And then to be in this ecstatic dancing environment is not only to just express myself in a way I want, but to feel how the dynamics in the room are shifting in real time, and to be able to read what's happening with one person or the whole room at once.
Yes, yes. And what I found fascinating is that these ecstatic dance parties, I don't know how it is in Canada, in the Netherlands, they are facilitated.
Yes.
So for those in the audience who don't know ecstatic dancing, there are 3 rules. Number 1 is there are no shoes. Number 2, there's no alcohol or drugs. And number 3 is there's no speaking. So basically everyone arrives, and then there's a sort of kind of meditation or a big circle and guidelines on how to behave. And then people just dance, but it's facilitated, especially the start. So you create this safety, this environment where it's okay to be just you and dance without rules.
Yeah. And, it's like DJ as facilitator. Like, you never think about it in that, or maybe you don't often think about a facilitator in that way, but like a DJ at a club, let alone at an ecstatic dance setting, is reading the room and figuring like, where is the energy? Is it peaking too much? Is it too low? How do I shift what's happening here? And you're doing it in this nonverbal way.
Believe it or not, but I recorded an entire podcast conversation about the similarity between a DJ and a facilitator.
I love it.
Yeah,
I
with
get
Howard
it.
Gray.
And but in the corporate environment, like those of us who've come to facilitation through corporate because they told us to do it, it's really easy to approach facilitation in this very corporate way, which means like read all the books and create all the frameworks and design process and design thinking, like all that stuff is great, but it's always only half of the story. The other half of the story is abstract and nonlinear and non-conceptual and embodied. And I think to be a good facilitator, you need to be able to move through both worlds, which is like, what do I think this moment needs? And then what do I feel this moment needs? And will I allow myself to move from one to the other?
And so, yes, yes, yes. Totally agree. And still, I wonder, I think that's where the big gap is between us facilitators and them, air quotes, normal people. And we had we already laughed about it before we started recording about our friends and family saying, oh, stop being a facilitator. I think that many of us live the gap that the clients who hire us in the first call tell us, please don't start with this, how do you feel, and sit in a circle and sing Kumbaya. And I don't want to unpeel the onion and start with Adam and Eve and talk about my feelings. Just get stuff done. So how do you keep this balance between everything that you've described, which may sound very woo-woo for people who are not from our world, and giving the client what they think they need, but actually only want?
Yeah, I think it's like helping them understand how we said at the beginning, the difference between wants and needs. It's like emotions get a bad rap in business. To be emotional is to cry or to get angry, and then that's it. But at a real level, emotions are often the wrench that keeps things from moving forward. One of the most massive emotions that are out there right now is the fear of change. We're all on the cusp of a new world, whatever that means. whether you mean that practically or whether you mean that, woo-woo new agey. It's like we're moving into a new world and we're still hanging on to 2019 in a really desperate way. And we can read all the books we want about what the world will function like, but the terror of letting go of what was and the grief that comes with that, like the non acknowledgement of that is what keeps us from stuck. Like you listen to Esther Perel enough and you understand how psychology works. It's like lots of people are harboring traumas from their parents without knowing it. You get together with somebody because you think they're attractive or you think you've got the same hobbies or something like that. And it turns out that you've just found somebody who's got the matching conflict style or the opposing conflict style to the one that you were raised with. So by bringing awareness and consciousness to these things helps you move past them and get somewhere new. It's like,
how would you facilitate that very concretely? So do you have maybe a favorite exercise that you want to share or a storytelling exercise? I don't know, to help these stubborn corporate people to lean into emotions or to make them see the value of emotions?
I'll give you an exercise, but before I do, I want to say that like the work starts with me first, which is like, do I acknowledge how scared I am to bring up emotions with this big, scary guy with his arm crossed across his chest? Early on in my career, I was terrified of it. Like, as a bit of backstory, after this walking trip, I started a storytelling training business. So in the kind of mid 2010s, 2015, 2016, 2017, I was flying all over the world and delivering these kind of corporate storytelling workshops. And especially at the beginning, it was very much in line with what people expected. One day, 8 hours, come in, learning objectives, everything structured in advance, PowerPoint, exercises. It was a workshop the way that a workshop is envisioned. It was like a learning experience. And it didn't really work because it was this conditioned learning experience that wasn't really challenging the underlying issues that interfere with good storytelling. And so I gradually started to gain more courage saying like, hey, I know you think you want X, but what you need is Y, and I'm going to deliver Y. And if you don't believe it, trust me. And if you can't trust me at this price, great. Here's some of my colleagues,
I love it. If you cannot trust me at this price, thank you. Yes. Your audience, please.
Yeah.
Save that. Yeah.
But it's like, I love using relationship metaphors because I'm a people watcher, and it's like, if you keep trying to spend all this time trying to convince this guy with his arms crossed across his chest to love you, it's like, no, let it go and find the people who actually are going to love you because they're already speaking in this way or they're much more down this road. And I think in my experience, that's way easier said than done. I'm still struggling after those clients sometimes. And my worst sales calls come when I speak to someone who doesn't get or value what I want and or what I deliver rather. And I try to convince them. It's like, they're not convincible. It's not the way it works. But what I can do is say like, hey, if you feel safe, we can talk about what's really going on here. And that invitation often is enough to let people kind of uncross their arms a little bit and say what's really happening. One practical lesson I've learned is in a sales call, never do a sales call with a group. Never speak to like the buyer and the buyer's team, because the moment there's multiple people in the room, there's dynamics that I haven't yet discovered. I don't understand what's happening between them. And so I'm speaking to all of them and their dynamics. It's too hard. Get one person, get them off the record, get them to speak about what's really happening. And on my side, I'm assessing like, okay, is this somebody who's willing to have the kind of conversations that I want? With you, we've spoken now, this is our second time speaking. We had the discovery call and then now this. And like the moment I sat down and we looked at each other, like you were excellent at just having this beat of silence where there was like I'm arriving and you're arriving. And in that moment, I knew that we had, I'm going to say chemistry in the professional sense, where it's like, oh, here's a person who can speak at some degree on my level. And I don't mean that egotistically, but like somebody who can hold the space that allows for this conversation. So I'm assessing that when I speak to somebody, within 30 seconds, I know the truth,
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you for the compliment. Appreciate that. Even more, thank you for putting your finger at what it is. And I love using dancing metaphors as much as you love relationship metaphors. Beside ecstatic dancing, I have danced Lindy Hop quite a while. And so it's swing dance, couple dance, swing dance. And the funny thing is, before you start dancing, so you get in this kind of open position, which is half, being in arms, but only with one arm. And the first seconds is just finding the beat with each other and seeing whether we're on the same, whether we got this chemistry. And yeah, it's 10 seconds. In 10 seconds, I know this is going to be a fantastic dance, or this will be a dance where I just pray for every second that over fast. And yeah, I see your point that when getting on a call with someone, you can sense immediately, is this person present and can they hold the space? Is there space for me to be me?
And I mean, it depends on, for some of your audience there, you're delivering sometimes very practical workshops. Like if you're going to take someone through a design thinking process, which is wonderfully valuable, then there's a discrete set of deliverables. You have much more structure, and then imagine even more at the extreme of structure, like a safety training or a COVID training or something like that. Like it's very, or a diversity and inclusion training. It's very clear, like, what is it that you're trying to deliver and how does it work? But for me, I want to be much more on the abstract and conceptual end of things. So the first thing I have to do is subvert. I keep saying this word subvert. I have to subvert someone's existing expectation. And there are certainly visionary clients out there who get it right away. And they're like, yes, I need this. This is the heart of the problem. And there are people who aren't there yet, who are more inclined to buy more structured trainings. So it's like, by the time I get into the room or I get into working with the team, I want people to know what it is, that type of energy I'm bringing. It's like, if you think this is too woo-woo and you want to see this as like me in my tights dancing around in my ecstatic dance, which we both learned that I do, it's like, great. Then if that's the way you want to see it, that's the way you want to see it. But if you see this as like fundamental and important to moving people through change, giving people satisfaction in their work, creating creativity, curiosity, innovation, like all of that is emotional, right? Creativity is an emotion. It's not a structured practice, or it's a combination of those things.
So would then creativity, and I'm coming back to the question and asking you for something practical. Because I think everyone, and personally, I know that I get hired by the group of the cool ones who want workshops in a different way. And then I have my exploration calls with those who will sit in the workshop. And then you have the hippo. I tell you one thing, don't come around with your woo-woo stuff. Don't ask me how I feel about this problem. I can tell you right away what everyone in this room think about it. So actually, we don't need a workshop. Just ask me. We all know this stereotype of person. How do you crack them in a
practical way?
Yeah, and kind of in an inviting, non-managerial way. You cannot force them, as you said. You cannot convince them.
I think you have to start by doing it one-on-one for sure. It's like, get them out of that performative context. And it's like, hey, what do you want to see happen here? What's your goal? What's your vision? And often with these hippos, it's like they believe something and they want to see something happen, and the world hasn't created space for them. Like I have to say this in this conversation around COVID, like, I'm double vaxxed, everything is good. Don't worry, I'm on the good team, everything is great. But it's been really interesting watching how the bad people are really maligned. It's like there's a stigmatization of them that is similar. I won't go too far down this road, don't worry. I'm sorry, listeners, for saying the C word. But there's this like inability to say what it is that needs to get said. And I think with hippos, it's often the same thing. It's like There's an inability to be, how do I say this? It's a bad feeling to be the one who's the dissenter who gets outvoted. You often feel bullied, or you feel not understood, or you feel not heard. And, if you wanted to do choice A and everybody else wanted to do choice B 5 years ago, most people aren't going to quit when their choice or their impulse isn't followed. And so what tends to happen is it metastasizes, the anger, the lack of engagement, the frustration, the powerlessness, the helplessness, like that's all emotional stuff. And so sometimes it's not like, oh, tell me about your feelings. It's like, hey man, what's going on? Like, let me bring a more authoritative energy to being a therapist, So it's not just like, oh, I'm sorry about that. It's like, yeah, I hear you. That really, it really effing sucks.
That sucks. Yeah.
Yeah, man, that sucks. I hear you. Yeah. And that can be the lube that gets the momentum going. It doesn't have to, like, I think those people are saying, don't give me the soft woo-woo, tell me about your feelings approach. Give it to me a little bit tougher and a little bit stronger. And I mean, I love Esther Perel because she does that sometimes, where it's like, she can be a warrior. You can be a warrior as a facilitator. It can be really noble work. It doesn't have to be like long-haired and peace man and kumbaya all the time.
Good point. And thank you for the reminder. It's also about, taking the space and taking the authority and daring.
I have a colleague who she told me the story about being in a room once, and to facilitate a process, and everyone's having this conversation, and she interrupted everybody and she's like, hey, like, did your boss just tell you to be here? You're not here. Because if I care about this more than you care about this, it's not going to work. So if you don't care about this, tell me what you really care about so we can have that conversation. But if you're feeling obliged to do this thing that your boss told you to do because diversity and inclusion is important, or blah, 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 it's like, we all know it's not going to work. So let's actually talk about what we need to talk about. And you know what? If we do it once, it might save us a ton of time for the next year or 5 years or 10 years. It can be over quickly.
How liberating to get the permission to actually put off the mask and say, okay. Yeah.
And that's why I said earlier, like, I have to face my own fear as a facilitator of taking off the mask and appearing unprofessional, unstructured, like not knowing what I'm doing, failing myself. You've got this question, like, when does a workshop fail? Well, it fails when I'm afraid to fail because I'm too controlling about what I want the outcome to be. And so that's a lot of inner work on my side to be like, I'm willing to fail in person, and be vulnerable in front of you so I can set the tone of vulnerability or set the tone of insight.
It's funny, I was about to ask this question.
I read your mind.
Yes. I'm thinking too loud. And maybe a provocative question to dig deeper to what you just said. So one way to fail it is to be too attached to the outcomes that you define for yourself. So is then the best solution not to define any outcomes and not to be ambitious at all?
No, of course, it's not that binary. It's not like, okay, the only way to facilitate is kumbaya. Like, we know as facilitators, that's not true. I say that I'm a professional outsider, and I know from group to group, I'm using different skills and different tools. Like, my toolkit is robust, but it doesn't mean I have to use all of them in every engagement. What you're paying me for is my ability to be artisanal about it, to take that beautiful, that tool that you've created that's got all the different ideas and podcast episodes that you've recorded now, and to be like, from all of that, I'm going to focus on these 3 things because that's most appropriate in this context. So, like, I think it's about integration. It's not one or the other. It's not to say I'm just going to throw my hands off and let chaos take us. Like, no, sometimes I need to create structure, but it's always customized. It's always customized to the moment, the group, the situation, the vision, the need. I can say, looking at there's themes that are in common, but it's never like step 1, step 2, step 3.
Mm.
And for me, like growing up as a consultant, coming at this from a logical business perspective, that was a really hard lesson to learn, because I kept trying to crack the code of like, okay, but like, what is it to be a good facilitator? Just tell me the 5 steps, you know, all those blog posts, 5 things you need to know to be a good facilitator. It's like, well, it's more dynamic and creative and fluid than that. And that was a really hard lesson for me to learn. It took me a decade maybe, and I'm still learning, of course.
I was about to say that. Yeah, it's the inner work that never stops, right? Which also makes it beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started doing this, in addition to thinking of myself a facilitator, I thought of myself as like an artist in residence in business, where my role is to be a professional outsider. If I agree with what everyone is saying and doing, then I'm not doing a good job of being an outsider. I need to bring different perspective, and I need to challenge, and I need to be more on the margins. You know, I'm a marginal person, and if I was in the center, then I would hate it, but my clients would hate it too, because if I'm just saying what Simon Sinek says or Adam Grant says or Brene Brown says, like, they could just go to them, buy their books, you know, watch their TED Talks. I have to be something, I want to be something that's a little bit more dynamic and creative and weirder too, if I can use that language.
Yeah, weird is definitely the new cool.
Yeah, I think so.
I somehow hear that the impossibility then to have an internal facilitator. I mean, there are some organizational cultures that would allow this outcast living within, but I think only very few. Do you believe in effectiveness of internal facilitators?
Again, it depends on the goal. Like if you're conducting regular trainings and you're having important conversations, like in tech, a Scrum Master is a great example of an internal facilitator.
Point.
Where your role is to bring together people who have different agendas and different outcomes and different metrics in mind and facilitate that conversation. Like you can be an outsider of the team and still an insider of the organization. But I think, you know, in traditional corporate structure, facilitators are under HR or under learning development. They're like in this stable off there in never land. And I think in HR, they now have this business partner modality where, you know, you're in the business and you're part of it, but you're also out of it. And I think like it's really important to, as a facilitator, to continually get these outsider experiences if you can't get them inside of the organization. So like going to conferences or festivals like the one you facilitate and being exposed to different ideas and a different world. One of my other sidelines, in addition to being ecstatic dance, maybe this will surprise you, is I love Burning Man. I've been to Burning Man 8 times. My wife and I got married there. I'm so passionate about it. And I'm passionate because it's so marginal. It's less marginal now than it used to be, but that's a different story. But being exposed to all of these weirdos in their own silo of whatever weird means lets me take the little pieces that I want of this and bring it back into my practice.
It's funny that you mentioned that. It's last year I officially wrote to Burning Man asking them whether it would be okay for IP issues to have this subline for Never Done Before, the Burning Man of facilitation.
They said no for sure.
They said no for sure. Because I think that's, for me, this, if we had something like this for facilitators, where we can come as we are, everyone brings a piece, shares generously, learns from the others, and it is a celebration of art and our craft. And that's what I imagine for Never Done Before. And we're getting there. We're not calling it Burning Man.
But I think, you know, it's like the difference between form and function. You know, it doesn't need to be in the desert with a bunch of weirdos and all the other things that come with it. Like I love daytime Burning Man, where I'm out wandering around. I sit in a cafe. I'm like, someone's reading my tarot cards. I'm having wonderful conversations. And I'm looking at amazing art. And I love less nighttime Burning Man, where it's like lights and music and drugs and all of that. It's like, whoa, let me go to sleep and wake me up in the morning so I can watch the sunrise. So the form it doesn't need to be that form in totality, but it can be the stuff you're talking about: inclusion, creativity, experimentation. And then
Purpose.
you invent a new form, like Never Done Before is a new form that takes some of those components, but integrates other as well.
And I think as long as we come together around a shared purpose and shared values, and then we're back full circle at what facilitation actually means, right? The reason why Burning Man has such a magic impact on those who've been there, and it's still on my list, is because everyone comes there with around a shared purpose and with a mindset and behavioral kind of catalog that they committed to follow.
Yeah, I mean, definitely one of the reasons. I would say too that, like, it's like when you go to a buffet, there's some people who go and say, okay, what's the food that's available? And I think especially in organizations, we have a tendency to look out and do these kind of competitive analyses where we're like, what are the available options? Should I do this training, or this training? Should I use this business model or that business model? Like, what are other people doing? Let me copy it. And I think what the artist does is the artist looks at a buffet and says, I don't want any of this. Can you make me something else? Like, oh yeah, there's a little bit of kale and there's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Like, let's experiment and create something that's new. And on one hand, especially in the old corporate way of thinking, that's hugely vulnerable because you're breaking the rules and you're subverting the way it should be done. And there's no precedent for this, which means there's no data for this, which means there's no framework for this, and so on. But on the other hand, I think that's what this moment is demanding. We need to reinvent not just organizations, but the whole world to be more sustainable, to cope with COVID, to deal with all of these different things. And that requires not just saying, oh, this should be like the Burning Man of, but it's like you're creating the never done before of. And in 5 years, people are going to say, oh, this should be like never done before. Because it's like a future visionary thing rather than a evaluatory thing. I think that's the difference between competitive analysis and vision. Vision is I see something that doesn't exist yet. I'm not just creating something. I'm not just copying something that is. And I in myself and in others, I'm trying to raise people to that of like, cool, there's lots of great things out there, but what isn't out there yet? What's your version of that? What's your vision of that? You never got an email from somebody who said, like, can you start something called the Never Done Before Festival? You invented it, you iterated and you used process, but like it came somehow in a way that we don't really understand, I presume.
Yeah. And then instead of Burning Man of facilitation, it was facilitators and digital residents.
Yeah.
Same, but different. Yeah. This year it's a greenhouse.
And we fall in love with form, and it's the thing about form is it's so past. It's like what has existed. Let's perpetuate what has existed. And yeah, go for it.
So yeah, that's why I don't like brainstorms of, okay, imagine the best version of the future. I always ask, how can we fail for sure? What's the worst version of the future?
Yeah.
And then let's turn it around.
Yeah, I love that too. It's like, you asked earlier for an exercise, and the ideal exercise is break what people expect this conversation is going to be. So like I have a great icebreaker. This is a very practical one where I pair people up, even in Zoom. I just put them in separate breakout rooms and I have them draw a map of somewhere they grew up when they were a child. So what's your street? Where was the school? Where's the general store? Like, what did your world look like as a child? And then I put them in pairs and I have them walk somebody through the map of take me through your childhood. Here's the apple tree I used to climb. Here's the store that used to sell this, or here's the foods place that made the best ice cream. Like everybody has stories of childhood. And it's so interesting to see how when you pair people up and it suddenly brings this level of fullness and like the more of them comes to the conversation. And then what's interesting is, okay, we spend 3 minutes together. You show me your map. I show you mine. We share a little bit. And then it's like, great, new partner, same map. Now, are you going to take me to different places? You're not just going to repeat the same story, but you're going to show me something a little bit different. And, it's a 15-minute exercise, but it is so lovely, first of all, to break the ice, but also to say, no, more of you is welcome in the room. How much more of what you are normally pushing to the side can you bring back? Can you bring back your Lindy Hop dance? Can you bring back your creativity? Can you bring back more of who you are? Because you're going to need all of that if we're going to be really creative. You can't just be creative in like a 15-minute brainstorming session if nobody in the room feels engaged and alive and excited. Like being engaged, alive, excited, trusted, psychologically safe. I mean, choose your language. Those are prerequisites for creativity to emerge in the same way that they're prerequisites for love to emerge. You can't just be like, okay, Miriam, be loving for the next 15 minutes and then go. It's like, no, I need to trust you. I need to care about you. I need to feel safe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I can love. And then I can create. It's the same kind of thing. I told you I'm a corporate therapist.
Love it. Wonderful. To wrap it up, one final question. What does reinventing facilitation mean to you?
I want to use that same frame I just introduced, like the difference between form and function. Like in the mainstream world, there's a defined form for facilitation. And if you imagine a facilitator, you imagine somebody in a room facilitating a conversation. So the form has been really codified. But what I love about the word facilitation, we said it earlier, is it's like you're an easy maker. So you can be an easy maker. You can take that easy making function and apply it to infinite forms, including some forms that don't exist yet. And for me, like facilitation is an attitude I take to everything in life. And I do it not necessarily performatively, although my friends and family might disagree sometimes. But it's like, what does easy making mean in this conversation with you? What does easy making mean in my coffee shop? What does easy making mean? And like, once I take that attitudinal shift, then I can start to see it show up in different ways in organizations. And I think like, if you're a facilitator, you're like, yeah, but speak practical to me. I think what we have to see is that organizations are all going through massive transformation. They are going to be different than they were before. Whether that means Burger King getting involved in feminist issues, whether that means reimagining the way I produce and create my products and services. Like there's some level of transformation that's going to happen. And the transformation is going to be continually evolving, which means it's not just going from A to B, it's going from A to infinity. So we need facilitators in organizations more than ever. And in the future, everyone in the organization is going to be a facilitator. You'll have to be. But I think right now, visionary leaders it's just dawning on them. So selling that idea, demonstrating that idea, embodying that idea becomes the type of work that I think folks like us are going to be continuing to do in the future. Sometimes it will be in a room as a conversation. Sometimes it will appear to be coaching. Sometimes it will appear to be therapy. And sometimes it will appear to be consulting. But it's not any one of those things. It's all of those things at once. I think that's part of what I think reinventing facilitation for the future looks like.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Mary, thank you so much. This was so much fun.
Yeah. And I think I just want to end on this vision because I think it's beautiful. And I would just like to invite the audience to sit with this and to join us in dreaming bigger.
At the beginning of the call, I said that my word for the year is appreciation. I said this before we started recording. And the reason for that was because I'm so critical all the time. Because I often look at the world and feel like, why aren't we there yet? And I think that by bringing more appreciation to myself and my life, first of all, it's going to make my wife and my friends way happier. But also it's going to make the work easier because it takes off the idea that it needs to be done by tomorrow. Like this evolution is going to take us decades and centuries. So it's not about having it all done, but it's like enjoying the process. And I think the more we enjoy the process, the easier it is. So appreciate the process is maybe the mic I want to drop at the end of this.
Yes. Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you so much, Miriam. This is great.
Dum, 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 dum. That's the end of the podcast jingle.
Oh, that was so good. That was so fun.
Wow. Yeah.
Time
Thank
flew.
you.